Sure.
You had raised a good point, just to start with this. So, hi, everyone. I'm just going to jump into this. We were just talking about, I suppose you could say, the difference between now and 2016 in regards to how you would appeal to the masses. Not that, well, let's break that down a bit more. So what we were just talking about, and for people listening who don't know, I work in marketing. So I'm very keenly focused on tailoring messages to different groups, whereas some other people, not just on the right, but on the left, and essentially every political sphere, I find them talking about there's us, the people, the vanguardists, the intelligentsia, whatever it might be. And then there's the masses, the people. And I'm more concerned with tailoring messages to subgroups and phrasing things within their framework. And I think you had just made a point about how it was different in 2016 and how the stakes might have been differently. Would you care to repeat that?
So in really starting from 2014 and going on till 2019, there was a gap where a large population sort of went up for grabs. And this population was sort of a group of young white men predominantly who were disillusioned with woke culture, slowly creeping into places on the online, but starting in video games, but going to other forms of media. And I know for the course of the years between 2014 and 2019, this audience was contested for, with a large percentage of them becoming functionally right-wing, and then another, I think, somewhat smaller population, but large enough population so that it could be sort of have mainstream crossover appeal, became outright leftists, and then another very large segment, I think even larger than both of the previous ones, basically stayed in this holding pattern and hasn't moved off of just constantly complaining about woke culture in ways that seem kind of mind-numbingly, pedantic and sort of going nowhere to my tastes. But this enthralls a lot of people.
That's interesting. That, like, I think when we look at this group, like the disaffected white guy, and they, our opponents or whoever we want to phrase them as, they tend to say as much. And I wonder if it is the case that white men specifically tend to be the troublemakers, and, we call them dissidents, effectively, but the powers that be, the power structure, would call them troublemakers. And I wonder if, they might call them Nazis, might call them white nationalists. The word doesn't really matter because I think it's coming out of the same birth, and they try out a bunch of different words. But essentially what they're saying is, you are troublemakers, and I'm interested in what novel solutions they would come up with to neutralize the troublemakers. Now, we're all scared of, being banned, being deplatformed, being debanked, or even thrown in jail.
Yeah, there's been another big purge. Just 2 days ago, there's been a huge purge of PayPal got rid of a number of sort of liberal organizations that had platformed right-wingers indirectly. There was another purge at Stripe. The iHypocrite was, there are a lot of people who got hit, but the only one that I kind of know and follow is iHypocrite. And, another round of bannings. I've heard that Scott Adams has gotten canceled from a number of as well.
Yeah, Scott Adams, what a character. I heard some people trying to say, like, oh, it's not because of him, it's because newspapers are cutting back. I could believe both stories, frankly. The funny thing, I was curious to think, like, what you think the future will hold, because I'm sure you're one of the people who've been saying that, there's no real way to, out-censor yourself, to appease the people who essentially are persecuting you because of your fundamental beliefs. It doesn't really matter. They got the people who say the slurs. They're gone. But eventually they're going to work their way towards the people who just have these troublesome ideas. I was curious because you are such a keen mind when it comes to the organization of the dissident right itself, but also practicality. I'm curious what you think the future might hold, aside from bannings. Do you think they're just, because I'll tell you the context, my feeling is that they're ultimately going to come for anyone practicing revisionist history. And it's not going to be World War II related stuff or Holocaust related stuff. It'll be anyone who seems to question any sort of narrative, whether it's the French Revolution, maybe it's the Civil War, any of that will be on the table. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it's going to be less history. I think the stuff that they're going to target. I mean, obviously, it's going to be your typical revisionism around World War II is not allowed, and I'm kind of not a dissenter in that regard. But revisionism, I'm distinct. I'm with the mainstream on those questions, but to a certain extent, right? I obviously think there were a lot of allied atrocities that get downplayed way too much, but we won't get into that. The where was I? Yeah, so I think obviously, their other big bugaboo is sort of like statistical differences between demographic groups. That's a classic one. I think they've already done what they can without purging the biology departments of people, which they might try to do. But the big ones coming up, the big icebergs on the horizon for the cathedral aren't those sort of abstract topics having to do with history or biology. It's the imminent things like, what is the cause of our excess death rate in 2022? What is the origin of certain unknown viruses? What is the cause? Exactly what happened with our response to some of these disasters, and our response to our criminal justice response to a lot of dissenters. How has the FBI been used? What have leaders known and not known? These are all questions that would be pretty fatal for the mainstream consensus. And they're much harder to tap down because they have an immediacy the other ones don't. They'll probably ban their way out of it. As I said, you can't out parasocial these people on social networks they control. But, we'll see. These questions aren't going to go away for sure.
That's true. I had, on the topic of deplatforming and getting banned, I think, unfortunately, people are getting used to it. It's good and bad. Good in the sense that a lot of our people should be off Twitter because Twitter is bad. On the other hand, losing your bank account's not fun. And I always had this thought, and I want to run this by you to get your feeling on it. And I know you're active in this because you do events in real life. You have conferences and meetups and things like that. My feeling was, in the future, these will become a requirement for people in the dissident sphere, that contrary to what we believe now, meeting up in real life might in fact be safer than communicating online and having to deal with all the problems they make for us. Now, does that sound like a realistic proposition to you?
In the sense of like conferences, I mean, online, it's hard to imagine real life being safer than online in any ordinary way that we talk about safety, unless they radically reform the internet and get around VPN somehow. It'll always be easier just to sit at home and shitpost on whatever forum they let you have in some Russian server. But in terms of the real contest right now is to develop a method of trust among people, and it's really a question of quality rather than quantity. What sort of insulates you from pushback, hard censorship, and consequences is sort of being connected to people in the real world that will vouch for you, that are not so easy to besmirch as Nazis, and breaking down the barrier between people who are dissenters sort of in the mainstream and sort of the radical dissenters that we have online. That's sort of our next task. And that involves in real life communication. The other thing about in real life communication is that when you meet someone in real life, you know that they're a good actor. Well, if they've made some effort to get there and paid an entry fee, you know that they're not a troll. And instantly when you talk to someone in person, all these spurgy fights that don't really matter kind of fade away.
I've seen that. I'd say this to people on my chat all the time. I'm like, you have no idea how much all this drama would melt away if we just met each other. And it has nothing to do with people like being an asshole and being timid in real life. It's just that I know there's a lot of good people in our scene. You hear them talk. They're very, very reasonable, nice, level-headed guys. But you put them in front of a keyboard and they turn into assholes. I don't know why, but I'm also the same, so I can't be mad at them. You put a keyboard in front of me and I become a dumb idiot. As a joke, I guess, but it's very, very different than how I talk. But the moment you put people in a room that you find that none of this bickering really matters. Anyway, that's my feeling. And if we added that onto, we should be scheduling for the people who can't get along, do what Sam Hyde does, and let's just start our own little MMA thing. Let's just get all the worst of our weirdos, punch it out, and then we're done with it.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting, and that's what started this year, is the whole MMA stuff. I'm not so sure quite how promising that is, but it certainly is. And, I don't know. I'm too old to fight. This would be something that might appeal to me in my 20s or something like that, but it's just not where I am right now in my life.
MMA is missing a huge chunk of the population by not having older guys fight. I'm in my 30s, so I'm not in prime fighting age, but I could you can get a solid 3.5 minutes out of me. That's what I tell my wife too, but solid 3.5 minutes. Before I go on, I'm going to introduce you. I introduce people late, as is my style. I'm sitting here with the great Distributist. He can be found on YouTube and Odyssey, all of his videos, all of his live streams. You can also find the Fiddler's Green on Substack, where I believe you publish articles. Some people might also remember Distributist from, I believe you had a site called V Obscura. That was a magazine and a podcast. Is that true?
Was a long time ago. Yeah, that had a very short run. But yeah, I now just publish under my Substack at fiddlersgreen@substack.com. And I have a weekly podcast of the same name. And I'm trying to write more Substacks, but I have a very limited schedule because, I'm not a professional. I just do this in my spare time. So whatever I can do for the community, I'm always happy to oblige.
Well, I find this interesting because we were just talking about you being older. I'm not as older, but you have had a very interesting life. And I'm not only interested in people's ideas and what they say, but I'm also interested in who they are. And would I be correct in saying you're an engineer by trade?
Yeah, I am. I'm an academic, or not an academic, but I have a graduate degree in a technical field.
I know that usually doesn't come up a lot in these podcasts. When I spoke with Gio Pinaccetti, he almost didn't want to mention his academic background, but I find that stuff interesting. I work in marketing. Prior to that, I worked as a chef. So, a lot of synergy there. But that's why I tell people that, because it might color what I say. So that's why I'm so interested in communication and linguistics, in the psychology of things like that. So, I try not taint everything I say with that, but I find as I get older, everything is run through that lens. And that's what I found so interesting about you specifically is in a scene, broadly, when I say the scene, I'll call it the Dissident Right. And when I say the Dissident Right, I mean in all its myriad of varieties, and like the pagans and then all the weirdos and stuff.
Everyone who's not a Republican and pulling in a rightward direction is Dissident Right. It's an incredibly broad canvas.
And increasingly bringing in a lot of the left. You can probably count Infrared Haas in here. You can count a bunch of these guys just in the milieu. But I found that you come at it with the energy of a man who has a career, and a man who has a family, and a man who has had a reasonable life. And I find that a lot of people in the scene don't have that for one reason or the other. Now, do you find that you've had conflicts at all with these other types of people, or do you find that having this energy, having this background, and having this sort of sober, reasonable tone has attracted a different type of audience member, or do you find you've had to deal with a lot of, let's say, antisocial personalities?
I think in 2018 there were a lot more antisocial personalities going around online, because that was the height of internet blood sports before the big banning started. There were sort of rumors of this person and that person getting banned, but there were no big perma bannings going on. That until Alex Jones got banned, I think in late 2018, this was not a thing. And so at that time, you would have just young guys come right off of poll and, just everything up to Fed posting right in your face and expect you to kind of match their power level. But this has really died down. I mean, of course, all social media, all alternative social media is clogged with this kind of style of thinking. But since the bannings, no one is wondering why you're not answering in turn. This stuff doesn't have a shelf life on social media. And I don't think it's particularly productive. I don't understand what. I mean, if it's an actual intellectual idea, then we have to discuss it. But trying to be really edgy and constantly signal power level and try to flout all these conventions is just counterproductive, and it's designed to generate controversy. And I think in 2019, the right wing learned that it couldn't sort of out-clout the left. Because I think people like Destiny and Vosh and all the left-wing debate bros really proved that they weren't doing anything that the right-wing debate bros weren't doing, but their edginess kind of got a blind eye, and furthermore, they could get mainstream repetition, mainstream endorsements more. So it was ultimately impossible to compete with these characters just from a social media clout point of view. And you can see this in the defections of people like Hunter Avalon from the right to the left.
Oh, yeah.
Kind of a classic brain dead person, but he knew which direction the wind was blowing from social media influencers.
And there's H3H3. There's a few guys.
Was he ever right wing? I mean, I don't know.
This is where you go. It depends where you land on the free speech argument. And I think a lot of the people who listen to our shows probably are a bit more advanced on that whole thing where it's like, oh, if you're free speech, you're automatically far right. We've always known that's kind of dubious. But I think he was just a free speech guy. Like, who's that other guy with the weird OnlyFans wife? Anyway.
The content cop guy?
Yeah. Exact same type of guy. Yeah. For one day, they'll defend your right to say the N-word, and the next day, they're opening a gulag. A tale as old as time itself.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is always the thing. Like, the N-word debate kind of just encapsulates that. It's just totally the wrong fight to fight, because that's what the left wants to convince themselves that what the actual debate is over just plain using racial slurs, when it's actually a debate over whether certain ideas can be entertained at all. Like, can you debate certain questions about the effectiveness of drugs that are being mandated? Can you have a conversation about policies that are being mandated in terms of compelled speech? Any of these things are open questions where it's not clear whether you're going to get banned or whether you're not. And one of the people who's sort of a friend of mine and sort of an associated personality, Aaron McIntyre, he got temporarily banned on Twitter today for talking about, at this point, the rather provable contention that major medical institutions in this country have been offering, maybe performing, cosmetic surgery on minors for the phantom reason of supporting or affirming transgenderism. And he got banned for this, right? So like that's where we are in terms of free speech. Like, you can't literally talk about things that are. I mean, we have like videos of them talking about this at the stage. Like, it's not these are things that, if they're not true, there is certainly evidence for them being true, such that any explanation of why they're not true would be kind of like almost silly, right? Where they just like creating a pantomime or something. I don't know. It's ridiculous, right? But we can't even have a conversation about this.
Yeah. And I also know that you are a Catholic, so you are very deeply invested in this sense of core truth, fundamental truth, ontological truth. I say this now because I've spoken to some other people who don't believe in that, who don't believe of a fundamental ontological thing in itself, truths. I was reading a bunch of Zizek the other day, and he goes on and on about that. But the reason I say
I'm surprised he doesn't believe in truth.
Man, if you read Zizek, I don't know if you have.
A long time ago, I read The Puppet and the Dwarf, which is his like the perverse core of Christianity.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Everything comes back to sex. Everything is downstream from sex with them. And at first, I thought that was kind of a pejorative thing against him. But like, no, he says it. He says it openly in this book I was reading. He says it in a bunch of books. That's why his whole thing is a pervert's guide to movies and blah, 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 blah. Oh, but anyway, the point I was saying was, when it comes to the trans thing, I know you as well as I am also a Catholic, but we have this idea we cling to that there is a fundamental truth to things. And I think the transgender issue is interesting because I don't think I'm being too optimistic about this, that the transgender issue will collapse in the future. People will turn against that. Maybe not other issues. There's a lot of issues in society that we're up against, but I think the trans thing is too cartoonishly egregious. I look at even child drag shows. There's normal people pushing up against that with vitriol. And so the question I have is, in that case, I'm looking ahead. I'm like, it is going to people are going to push back. That is going to fall out of favor. But what happens then? That's what I'm interested in, because what I think will happen is there will be a lot of revisionist history that goes on. I think within the next few years, you'll see a lot of drag queens out there saying, we were never in favor of child drag shows. There's going to be a lot of rewriting of this whole trans phenomena. And my thing is, maybe we have to start now to devise ways to not let them forget that, because I think this is such a crucial chunk of history we need to really remember.
Can they? I mean, this is one of the reasons why I don't think this is going to happen this way. You are absolutely right that this transgender stuff is absolutely bunk. It's absolute demonstrable bunk. You have the Atlantic magazine publish an article last week about how there's an open debate over whether there even are differences in performance on sporting events between men and women. Like, why do we even do that? All of this stuff is absolute bunk. And everyone knows it's bunk, but the reason they can't, I mean, you alluded to the reason why they aren't backing down on this one. They back down on this one, and like the right's going to hunt them down. I mean, how are they going to, what are you going to say about this? You're going to say that, oh, wow, we openly promoted a falsehood that everyone could see, and it turned out to be wrong because everyone knew it was wrong, but we said it was true anyway. No one's going to forget that, and the internet's going to prevent people from forgetting that. And the internet's one of the reasons why people can't give in, because they're aware that the record of them saying the opposite is easily observable.
Yes, and my fear is that I was just reading this book today titled On the Resistance of Evil by Force by Ivan Ilyin. And it kind of lines up with all these other books I was reading, because the topic there was that evil must be resisted. And he defines evil very specifically. He defines evil as anything that is anti-spiritual and anti-love. Now, that we don't need to talk about that. That's just how he defines it. But his proposition was that if evil is not resisted, it will spread. And I'm of the mind, I'm maybe apart from all the Republicans, a lot of people on the right, because a lot of people on the right have this day of reckoning fantasy where one day things will just correct themselves. One day everyone will push back against this spontaneously, kind of like a communist revolution in a sense. Like one day everyone's going to wake up and that will be proven right. And then everything's going to get better. And I'm like, I don't see that. I don't think that's ever happened. I think you need,
but that would be the equivalent of them losing on the trans issue.
Exactly. But I think that needs to be something that needs to be engineered by us. This idea of like, the idea that people will wake up and say, oh my God, we were wrong about this trans stuff. Like, I don't think that happens unless there's people on our side kind of guiding people to that and engineer a situation.
Clear here. Like, transgenderism goes down and the regime starts tilting in its foundations. Like that's the kind of seismic motion we're talking about.
I think so too.
The number of bureaucratic institutions that have signed off on this stuff are like enormous. Like I think certainly the American Pediatric Association has been signing off on some of this stuff. Yeah. We have like a lot of major universities, like a lot of major medical institutions. I don't know if the AMA has. They tend to be a little bit more conservative, but like they've gone down the line. They've gone to the DSM. They've made all of these modifications, and it's really hard to know who has publicly stated their approval of this and who hasn't. And this thing goes down. Everyone starts pointing fingers at each other, blaming everyone else for deceiving them. I mean, how does this not just course through the entire system and take down everyone?
Exactly. When I look at the transgender issue specifically, I look at it a lot like COVID. in the sense that it's ideologically hollow, and then so it just becomes the ward of the managerial state. It just becomes something that they can't admit to, even though no one likes it, even though no one believes in it. It's just, but we can't admit we were wrong, so we have to build up all this scar tissue around it to make it, so, to keep it here. Otherwise, if it's not, so it'll always exist in some form. You know, whenever we talk about, you know, I know you're a big fan of James Burnham and everything, but you know, when we spoke of in our show before in the managerial class, when I was actually speaking to Alt Skull the other day, and we were describing it, the government, as a plausible deniability engine, that it will never admit it's wrong, and it'll increase in complexity to never have to admit that it's wrong. And so when I look at transgenderism, I look at COVID, like, there's, first of all, no day of reckoning. There's no, like, aha, you were right. Come over here and get all your candy. I've never been told I was right my entire life, and I'm frequently right. But, you know, so I'm trying to prepare for that. I'm trying to prepare for the mutation that will occur when they try to keep this in place and trick everyone into thinking that A, they were never involved, and B, it's actually something different. And maybe they name it. I
don't know what this will look like, because they seem to be still doubling down, which is, you know, that's disturbing, right? Because I don't know. I mean, this could become just the religion of the state, in which case, you know, we're going to be forced into a position of separation from this apparatus somehow. I'm not so sure how.
I'm of the same way. And I'm very, just so you know, I know you probably don't listen to the show, but we don't use the term separation or civil war frivolously on the show. In fact, we've gave extensive coverage to try and tell people that, okay, I know everyone says the Civil War. Tim Pool says Civil War. People use Civil War a little too easily, and we try to break down, like, okay, if that comes to pass, here's what you can expect. It will be human indignities and atrocities you cannot even fathom. This should not be something we're encouraged. You know, not saying you are, but in general, people are a bit too happy about the idea of bloodshed, if that's a fair word for it. And so I'm like, let's make sure we've exhausted every single option before. I think like a third of the Dissident Right is hoping that, like, the power goes out and everyone grabs their knives and it's the purge. I'm like, no. It's all these people.
A horrific situation. That's like Rwanda.
Exactly. And I think most, you know, who never wants to do that? Anyone who's ever been in the military. So let's start with that. Let's start with the people who
any parent. Yeah. I mean, people will accept a military dictator very quickly at that stage. I don't think it will take very long for that to come about. So I guess, I don't know. I mean, who knows? We'll, like, speculating about all of these future, you know, what if alt history did this whole, like, Civil War 2.0 or whatever. Like, he's a big channel. And I don't like speculating about future wars, but what people want is they want an ability to separate themselves from this ideological apparatus, and no one knows how to do that yet. And a lot of the people in the center are really just afraid of stepping out against this stuff in a meaningful way. Like, they'll complain about Lord of the Rings having, you know, a diverse cast, but then they can't explain why, you know, they want to live in a nation and not some kind of, like, strange globalized airport, I guess.
And that's what's guided our investigations on the show, which is you have to be honest with yourself and say, what world do you actually want? And I find, not to needle the Dissident Right too much, but this is the left, this is liberals. They never ask themselves, what world do you actually want to live in and why? And conservatives will kind of give you like 1950s America or something, but that's usually, as much as we make fun of them for that, that's better than most can give, to be honest. And there's just to bring this around to GK Chesterton, there's a quote, I think it might have been from the Outline of Sanity or something, just on the topic of imagining war. And it was something to the effect of, the past is as wide and as detailed as all of human experience, and the future is as narrow as myself. And I love that line. I love that because it speaks to everyone. Whenever I hear people say, like, here's what the downfall is going to look like, it's like what you're imagining is a story with yourself. When people envision the future, and this is the problem with a lot of ideologies, they're way too simple, but we can use the past and populate it with as much detail and lushness as we want. And just I'm taking a very long way to agree with you is what I'm doing.
Yeah, if you're imagining civil war and you're imagining yourself doing anything but a lot of running, then you're probably not being very accurate. I mean, maybe if you're a 20-year-old guy, you'll be actually fighting in it, right? But most of us will be kind of fleeing from mobs and stuff like that, which is just horrific again.
It is. There's this one line that I always hear on the Dissident Right, and I know it's said in a very positivistic and very, kind of self-helpy way, but it's kind of like you would see this text overlaid over like a scene from 300 or some ripped fucking Roman guy, and it says, you are something to the effect of, you are like the latest in line of survivors and warriors, act like it. And I'm like, I get why you say that, but also history is riddled with great men who just got shot in the back of the head and died in a swamp. Like there's again.
Plus, what do you do with that? What do you do with that? Like, how many people who talk about this stuff online are actually materially advancing some kind of solution to this in the event that happens? Very few of them. Oh, actually, probably none of them. And half of them who are actually talking about it are feds.
And this is why I like where the conversations start. For example, when someone says we need to have a parallel society or some kind of mutual aid network, I say, I'm with you. But then the next step is always some kind of weird farm that they played a video game of or something. And I think if we want to get serious about talking about what we can do to improve the material conditions of people who are being debanked, deplatformed, or being threatened in their very lives, like, what does that actually look like? And it can't just be, let's all live on a commune. When I ask a right-wing person, they basically say, let's start a commune. I'm like, well, if we get finer detail on it, we need something new to address new problems. And that's where I think it might be lacking. What do you think of that? Or am I way out to lunch?
I don't think that, the commune thing, I've heard that a lot. Some people are they're like moving to different areas and buying up land in the center of the country and actually moving there. That's been several people I know have done things like that. So that's a path. But, if you're talking about this, we need a little bit more critical mass to pull anything like this off. I mean, our main difficulty right now is that we don't really have a critical mass to kind of push back politically on any attempt to dispossess us further. And that's what people are really concerned about. And, I think that certainly moving to a rural area could be a better life for yourself. But if you actually have to have a plan to make a better life for yourself. You can't just move into an area that has no jobs and no broader horizons and that you're totally unsuited to integrate into, and then pop open the hood of your Volkswagen and go like, oh, I'm here, send me to the commune. That's not going to work, right? These are plans that very high agency adults make that have their finances in order, or people who are kind of linked into a broader social movement that might be able to support this and facilitate this and link them in with other people. And right now that's infrastructure that we haven't built, and to do it individually requires a lot of, again, financial independence and a lot of ability to take risk. And you have to be in a certain point of your life too.
On that topic, I was going to say, based on your years of experience in the scene, having these events, having all these shows, and having people come to you and ask you questions, do you feel more or less optimistic now than you were, let's say, in 2015 or 2016?
I don't know. I think I'm optimistic about the current space I'm in. I think we have a lot of high quality people. My desperation is that for the mainstream of society, I guess, I felt that there would be some immune responses that have kicked in, and those immune responses haven't kicked in yet. Maybe everyone's just still in shock from COVID, but I'm talking to people who are sort of more mainstream conservatives that have come out of lockdown and they're still doing the whole boomer thing again, like, oh, things are going back to normal now. No, nothing's going back to normal anymore. There's a new reality that's forming up, and if you're not comfortable with how things are, then you're going to have to develop a radically different attitude about the world and actually talk to people who are younger. And there's just an unwillingness to believe that, and there's a fear that a lot of people have of what they'll be forced into if they admit that. And so what you have as a consequence are, except for sort of a corridor of people, of younger people who are kind of high agency and more elite, the people who have the resources and the ability to really make an impact are just kind of satisfied to run out the clock of their lives, pretty much, not take any more risks. And I don't know, maybe the oncoming economic hardship that's building up this winter is going to move the needle and get people to reconsider this. But they got to start thinking in new directions, and I'm not so sure who the right people are to get to these people.
Yeah, in stream, it might have been the last stream, the last one or the one before, you had made an interesting point, I thought, where you had said that one of the many problems that's plaguing our scene right now is our funding disappearing. And you had said the types of people that typically find themselves in this political scene, or talking like we are now, talking about real practical futures, tend to be people who are in the emerging middle class. They tend to be of a certain age. And they tend to be, for example, I'm in my mid-30s and I'm married and I've got a job, and we might not have as much appeal to the youth as like a Hassan Piker might. And their audience is all like, what, Christ, I don't know, 14 to 13 and a half. I don't know how old these people are, but that's a totally different political energy. And I was wondering, do you think that appealing to the youth important, let's say, 17 to 23, do you think that's an important demographic? Do we have them, and should we seek them out, do you think?
Well, we definitely don't have them. I mean, young people like the left. That's what the left tells young people what they naturally want to believe. Take the politics that come naturally to the 13-year-old. That's basically what the left is. The problem is that they never grow out of it. The only thing that's going to eventually change the fortunes on the right are the fact that the left wing are transparently dysfunctional people and will not be appealing to younger people because they're transparently dysfunctional. That's why, for instance, Hassan, the reason why he's appealing is that he's kind of like a sporty guy. He's kind of quasi-masculine. Like, he does kind of like the body. And I don't think he's really all that built, but, like he affects that personality, right? He affects this turbo-masculine personality while telling them, every 14-year-old exactly what he wants to hear, and not getting banned off social media for his edginess. You've got the perfect combination that appeals to young people. That's not the route that the right wing can take to appeal to the young. The route that the right wing takes to appeal to the young are like, okay, what life do you imagine for yourself? Who are the people you know in your life that actually have their head screwed on the right way? And look at your average leftist and compare him to your average right winger, and what looks like a more appealing life path. And it's the path of mentorship and the path of aspiration that will lead people away from the left, not some kind of clout or message driven thing. It can't. That entire game, for a variety of reasons, both institutional and essential, will always be sort of a left wing game.
That's a good point. Now, before I respond to that, I will just say, for those listening who were wondering, if I deemed it possible, or desirable rather, I could, in fact, fold Hassan up and throw him on top of the fucking school. I'm just putting that out there. Now, to your second point, that's something that I never considered before, and I find that fascinating. This idea of mentorship, and the idea that perhaps the dissident right and those who have their lives together, and those, I always say, never take advice from someone who's not living the life that you would like to live. And I'm going to act like I came up with that. But I think that is something I've noted on the right. And I look around, and I truly do believe I am speaking with some of the greatest minds of my generation when I speak to them on these interviews. But I see a lot of people who have their lives together. I see a lot of people who are in functional relationships, who have jobs and seem, we play up that we're mentally ill weirdos, but most of the people that I see have it together. And if that is something that the left does not have, that could be one of the best inlets to the dissident right, I think. Now, I don't know if anyone else is doing that or doing any practical outreach to the youth, but, I think they're getting primed for it. Every time I see, videos from a classroom.
How would you do that, right?
Exactly. This is the thing. And that's the conversation I want to have with people. And how we would interface more with this demographic. Because like you said, like these people, they're weirdos. I can't believe that someone looks at H3H3, at this morbidly obese, just like depressed, sad, it takes him 5 seconds to respond to anyone because he's full of various pills. He talks constantly about his penis doesn't work. Like, you look at that, there's something, you laugh at him because he's a clown. But eventually you're like, yeah, these guys are gross. Hassan looks gross. He dresses like shit. He's a weird guy. They got Funko Pops everywhere. I think there is a possibility to actually be...
This just shows me how little I know about Hassan. The only thing I know about Hassan is that when he likes making like these gym bro pictures of himself where he looks like some kind of Turkish, well, I guess you could say... very thin gym rat, not a particularly meaty guy, but
this is the funny thing.
Like image.
The funny thing about Hassan is he has very gay photogenic characteristics. Like, if you look at his photos, I had someone yelling at me the other day because I'm saying I don't think Hassan's good in a fight. Like, have you seen him? Look at his lats. I'm like, first of all, I've never seen a lat, never will. Second of all, like, but he has that thing where, like, when he's taking a photo, he puts his thumb in his boxers and kind of teases it down. Like, no, that is. It's like there's a lot of real gay stuff. He's got his mouth kind of open. I'm like, no, he's doing like a weird Calvin Klein shoot. And so I think even the guys looking at that, I bet guys look at a guy like Sam Hyde and say, that's cool and tough. And they look at Hassan, it's like, you look like you are an Instagram filter, and that is off-putting.
Yeah, I mean, this is, the thing is, though, like, you're saying that, and young men are just not my demo. I don't really make content that appeals to... I make content that appeals to guys that are over the age of 25 for the most part. And I think that's my demographic if you were to break it down via YouTube. And I haven't looked at that for a really long time. But it certainly isn't Hassan's demographic of like 15-year-olds. That's just not what I appeal to at all. And it's not that... I don't think this demographic is directly reachable through social media. I think they're only reachable through real life influences and sort of the realities of growing up in post-COVID America and having a left wing that doesn't really speak to them. I think the difficulty with the left wing is that they always want to promise young white men that if they just develop the right set of opinions, there's going to be a place for them in the left wing coalition. And this is never true. There's a place for very young men, but once you get to hit about 30 and you're not a complete wreck for some other reason, you're to the bottom of the stack for sure. And your oppression Pokemon points are bottomed out, and the idea that you're going to have a voice or an ability to advance your own interests politically in an environment like that, like the modern left, is ridiculous, which is why virtually all of the older breadtube creators have all developed some trans identity. Obviously most famously ContraPoints, and then immediately following ContraPoints in an incredibly creepy way was PhilosophyTube, that seemed to take basically just be like a Xerox copy.
Oh yeah,
it almost like have like a stalker vibe, to be honest. I don't know. It's really weird.
Yeah, before YouTube got banned, our most popular video was where we were calling PhilosophyTube a skinwalker.
yeah. Well, I think I actually heard that one. Yeah. But you know what I mean, right? This is the path of all older people, is they all develop identities, sort of sexual identities that are twisted in a way. And if they don't, like, this seems to be kind of an end of their career as a leftist. I guess there's sort of space for like H3 guys where they're like the dumpy straight white guy, or I guess in H3's case there might have to be some scare quotes around that, but the this is the path to being kind of like of being like a father figure on the left that's scary for them, because it raises questions about authority and their priority and their political priorities, I should say.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of responsibility that comes with trying to appeal to younger people. So one phenomena I noticed on the right, and this is, one could say this is a problem you want to have. What I found was the development of the far right, dissident right, whatever it might be, into having such a variety of content available. If you look around, like there are a lot of content creators, and there's a lot of good content being made. It's to the point where if you wanted to, you could completely check out of mainstream media and out of the left. And there are people, especially young people, where all they consume is content on the dissident right, or even adjacent sort of things. One example, and these guys are not on the dissident right at all, but the example I gave was like a red letter media. I like red letter media. And people would always joke that there's more people who watch red letter media's reviews of Picard than the actual show Picard. And I believe that. So that's interesting though, that you could be, your entire world could just be, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, just these content creators. Now, what that means is that's a very different type of socialized individual, especially if you're coming at this from the age of like 15 or 16. And I got a few of those in my community. I know you got a few too, but that is a lot of responsibility, because these are also guys who aren't, joining the military. They're not being socialized in any other way. So and then especially if they're in kind of like the Nick Fuentes camp, they've been socialized to be too ironic all the time, to the point where I don't even think they know if they're being genuine at any given moment. And that's a weird mind to try and wrangle. Now, I'm just
you don't want to have this mind. You don't want, and this is I kind of should have made this an essay as opposed to a live stream, but I did a podcast on this called Dissent, Detach, Deatomize. And what I wanted to sort of express is that you as a dissenter, you need to balance this against the oppositional objectives of detaching from unhealthy behaviors, say like listening to podcasts or being in front of screens 24/7. And you also need to fight against the process of atomization, which dissenting naturally does encourage you to do those unhealthy behaviors. So like, it's no use to have a bunch of dissenters that are just Chan posters. That doesn't do them any good. It doesn't do us any good. It doesn't actually materially move the cause of helping humanity forward in any meaningful way. And so, really developing a dissenting ideology only is useful if you can somehow incorporate this into a lived life where you're not just this atomized, isolated individual, and where you're actually pursuing some amount of spiritual, financial, physical, and social health. And that's a hard balancing act. And I can give people tips, but the tips tend to be very particular. They tend to be you have to kind of know where people are to give them advice on what the next step should be.
We were speaking before about how interesting it would be if people just met in person and they realized that all this drama kind of melts away. And I was listening to some of your clips. I was listening to clips from a guy named Academic Agent, who I know you're familiar with. To the listeners who don't, to the listeners who don't know, check him out. Great channel. But and he had released a couple clips that, again, I'd recommend people watch. I believe it was like a recommendation to fix Britain's politics. It's like a two-parter. A lot of people talk about that. But what I found, what's so interesting, is that when you ask anyone on the dissident right about what to do to fix the world, that's where the opinions diverge about how to save the West. Everyone's got kooky ideas. When it comes to what should we do next year to make things better, I find most people fall in line. Like when I was listening to you on Adam and Sitch, and people listen to that seriously. It's so cool. But he's like, what would you like?
5 policies, and I think most people on the right wing would agree with them.
Right? That's the thing. And I don't care, Christian, pagan, atheist, weirdos, all different types, all different stripes. I bet they would all agree on those 5 policies, and those 5 policies would be, we don't need to list them up, but they were
I think they were like limit immigration, make the universities pay for their own bad debts, create a massive jobs programs. And I think there are a variety of other ones having to do with the reform of bureaucracies and stuff like that.
Exactly.
Yeah. But that's, the specifically reforming academia and also allowing a broader exploration of freedom of association, tying it less to which identity group wants to associate and more to what they actually want to do.
Yeah, and when we list that, I bet a lot of people say yes, that would make things very good right away, and that would cut across. I always think that there's always conflict between the Christians and the pagans, and then even the few Hindus we have on the scene. But I'm like, you know what? Like once it comes down to that, if you accomplish that, people would still kind of get along. And I genuinely think, and maybe you might disagree with this, but if you do, let me know. I think if pagans were in power tomorrow, let's say they had the hand on the lever, they wouldn't destroy Christianity or destroy the Christians.
No.
Yeah.
No, I don't think they would. I don't think that's the conflict. And that's not what, I say like, when I went to the latest conference, like all of our differences fell away. And that's right. It did it with specific people I met. But then like a month later, I got drawn into internet drama with the pagans. And, I'm trying to get out of it. Like I'm trying to reply to the stuff in private so this doesn't start up again in really cringy ways. But the difficulty with the sort of pagan Christian divide is that how should I put this? I'm not trying to start up drama. I'm honestly not. I'm not worried about them like getting into power and like illegalizing Christianity. What I think what's difficult for me is that I feel like they're just kind of like throwing out low blows and like they're re-upping progressive talking points about history that they're re-upping the progressives' own points about history. And I find this kind of like progressive points by history, and then also sort of strange notions about like Nietzsche and slave morality. And if this was just a theological conversation, the drama would be over, and we could just talk about who's spiritually right. But it seems that like what people want to do is kind of create like an anti-Christian right-wing identity, and I don't see like pagan anti-Christianity. I don't see how that's commensurate with trying to preserve anything that we recognize as classically Western culture in any form. And I don't see how it doesn't immediately feed into sort of the deconstructive elements that the left already performs and we're already aware of.
Yeah, and to that point, on this show, we've had a great many interviews, and we've had pagans on this show before, and some of my best friends are pagans. But one thing,
some of my best friends are pagans too. Like it's not like I know a lot of these guys are great guys, right? But I don't like encountering this specific kind of pagan argument where it's like, Christianity is responsible for the West's decline or something like that, and it's a bizarre argument, and it thrives on the kind of emotions that I remember in the new atheist movement, where like you're critiquing something that is real from a position that doesn't really have any substance itself. Like there's more consistency in the pagan critique of Christianity than there is consistency in pagan theology among pagans. And that's where the problem lies. And I don't want to have the conversation publicly, but that's what the issue we're having right now. And I'm trying not to like publicly make this any bigger than it is. I guess I've probably failed just then. But.
No. Hey, I'm just like you. I always fall into drama, or as I say, I don't get involved in drama. I just give news about people. But one thing, I think there's a clear divide you can draw between different types of pagans as well. Like I look at someone like Survive the Jive, and I'm like, well, here's a guy who seems to take it very seriously. He's a cool guy. He's got a lot of great content out there versus some of the pagans that I might have come across, which are guys who, if I could describe them to be, we're going to just do the movie 300, but with more witches and swastikas. And you know, the things I like about paganism, because we've studied paganism on the show, we've talked with pagans, and there's a lot of interesting stuff in there. One thing that I always found, and we cover this when we cover the book The Ancient City, was foundational to paganism was, you know, ancestral worship and bloodline worship and stuff. And I said, well, you run into a problem where the majority of a lot of these specific pagans would love to murder all of their ancestors going back 8 generations. I'm like, you can't square that.
Yeah, that's. I don't think they would want to murder them, but the difficulty is that in order for you to have sort of a common link with your ancestors, your form of paganism has got to be, first of all, you have the problem that had your ancestors been alive now, they would tell you to stop being pagan because they would be Christian.
That's kind of what I was getting at. Yeah.
The second problem is that, let's say you're looking at them and their lives, and you're going to embrace what they were and what they deeply valued. In order to do that, looking back, you need to develop a paganism that is incredibly pro-Christian, such that, you know, it doesn't really resemble the paganism. I mean, I know Survive the Jive, and I think he's probably with me on this one, because I know he's probably thought about this, but the paganism that comes out of that kind of historical synthesis has to take on so many Christian elements that it starts looking a lot more like Platonism or something like that than it does like Norse paganism. You can't pretend that Christianity didn't happen. That's not going to be an option. And then, you know, in a Hegelian sense, you have to ask yourself, if you are indeed trying to reintegrate pagan elements, and, you know, pagans should really be specific about what pagan elements they want to reintegrate, because if it's just maypoles, I don't really disagree with them at all. But like if just maypoles and like flower hats and stuff like that, you know, go for it. I love folk music, but I mean that Hegelian synthesis, you know, it's not going to look like what I currently see online. It can't, and so this is calling the people who conquered the world slave, like adherence to slave morality. When, you know, you're currently a refugee, which is the most likely fate of all of us, to be grimly honest, at some stage, that's not going to fly, right? There's no way future Westerners are going to look back at the people who conquered the entire globe and made all modern technology and go like, oh yeah, those cucks. That's not an emotion they will have, right?
Yeah,
so don't tell me that like that's the history you're peddling, because this is not going to fly.
Yeah, and like there's a lot of very serious pagans that I love, and then there's the ones who they have this line that its popularity has bewildered me, which is that, what was it, like Christianity is like a 2,000-year-old Jewish plot to turn Europeans Jewish. And I hear that a lot, and I've engaged
every time I hear that, I think of the Dave Chappelle line, like, "Gotcha, bitch."
yeah, well, exactly. I'm like, you know, Christians and Jews haven't really gotten along for, you know, quite some time, but I'm like, it's all part of the plan.
We tricked you into creating a world-spanning civilization unrivaled in history. Gotcha.
I know, because to me, it almost sounded like a lot like flat Earth stuff. Like maybe this started off as a thought experiment or a joke that just got out of control or something. But I hear a lot of people saying that, and they'll, you know, people who seem smart enough will say that. And I'm like, I just don't. I've tried to research it as best I can. There's not, like, I saw what was it? A really great debate people should watch. I mentioned this when he was on. Tyler Hamilton was with Adam Green. And that's a great debate between a guy who's a devout Catholic and another guy who, you know, proposes these sorts of things. And it was like right away, the debate topic was, did Jesus exist? And right away, Adam Green's like, yeah, he probably existed, but it doesn't matter because it's all Jewish. And like just conceded the debate and then went right past it into like another thing, which I always thought was funny.
There's just a bunch of unserious conversations that aren't worth having. I probably shouldn't belabor it, but I know. Look. Let's stop here and say, like, I get paganism. Like, I think I understand the emotion behind it, which is that we feel radically separated from these kind of landscapes, and this kind of bloodline that we know ultimately produced us at some primordial animal level. And, you know, like this is sort of like, you can see this motivation in people like Lord Byron and William Faulkner, to take an American example. And like, this is a very real emotion. And I don't know if that's a strong enough emotion to base a theology on, but like that emotion and that desire, like the right wing needs to figure out how to feed it and harness it. It doesn't need to embarrass it publicly. And I don't want to embarrass pagans publicly. I want to embarrass certain arguments that I just don't want to hear anymore. Like, I just don't want to hear new atheist takes coming out of right-wing pagans. And in the ones I already mentioned about, certain ethnic groups touch your religion, so it has cooties now. Like these are arguments that I want to get rid of. But like the people and their desire for the spirituality, like that's honorable, and that needs to be fed, and that needs to be directed in productive directions that will lead to the advancement of their spirituality and their families.
Yeah, that's very true. And one thing I noticed was that, just to again help reinforce the paganism, we're not trying to start an anti-pagan thing here, because I didn't bring this up when I was speaking with Alt Skull, but I wanted to. And one thing that I found was that we were talking about conspiracy theories. A lot of people don't like conspiracy theories, but I'd say whether you like it or you don't like them, they are relevant because they are so popular. So when I look at paganism, I don't think anyone's stupid. I don't think anyone's dumb. I don't think anyone's evil or wicked. So let's start with that. Secondly, I think that the popularity of this line of questioning and line of thought is relevant, whether or not I agree with it. Now, what I didn't bring up with Alt Skull was a lot of conspiracy theories share, I think, a lot of parallels with paganism in the sense that they treat old knowledge and old wisdom as de facto more true or better than anything that's now. So with conspiracy theories, a lot of times, like, they will automatically disbelieve anything that comes out of this cathedral, this system, whatever you want to call it, and they will automatically believe anything that's from like 1,000 years old. And I think that's relevant. So in a lot of ways, I look at all these things as just an extreme rejection of modernism in different forms. And so I look at that, I'm like, okay, I kind of see what's happening here. And maybe there's not a lot of thought put into some of it, but it's that rejection I find interesting. Now
yeah, I mean, a system only, and I understand the human impulse is when you discover something is lying to you, the natural assumption is to consider that it always has lied to you. But this system actually used to be a lot healthier, and it used to want to lie a lot less than it currently is lying. So there is that to consider. And the second thing to consider is that the second thing to consider is that systems only lie when they feel like they have to lie. The truth is always the best propaganda. So even if this thing was completely self-interested, it wouldn't be untrustworthy except in a few particular instances. So, I think I understand the impulse, but it's not. It leads people to these sort of paranoid approaches, epistemological approaches to reality that are just not very healthy.
And I think this is what I liked about distributism. And you had made something, kind of a comment there that, wasn't that bad that long ago, or it wasn't completely lost. And I think what I liked about distributism when I was reading GK Chesterton, distributism as, I don't know if maybe it's not even an ideology, but it's
pretty vague, to be honest. It's a lot of ideas that are past their shelf life, but they're still great. There's still great books. Like the Surfile State still holds up.
Yeah, well, I looked at it. I'm like, well, this is a guy who's working within an existing framework, and I treat with suspicion a lot of people whose perfect world ends with the fiery destruction of this one. I like people who have a historical literacy, who can say, who, just like we were talking about, admit that you cannot turn the clock back on liberalism. You cannot turn the clock back on Christianity. I don't subscribe to time machine and nationalism. So this idea that we have to work within these frameworks no matter what. And so when I looked at distributism and listened to what GK Chesterton was saying, I'm like, well, this is a guy who's being practical and reasonable. And because we haven't really talked about distributism much and the works of GK Chesterton, but does that sound accurate, or am I way out?
I think GK Chesterton would probably reject this idea of practicality. He had sort of this weird common sense and this weird sanity, but he eschewed sort of these more utilitarian notions that were popular at the time. You might call him some kind of practical idealist or something like that, right? But it's I don't know. It's hard to say, but like he had a certain groundedness in human reality. I think that's probably what most people are really drawn to when they see GK Chesterton, and that's what, when you look at something like Orthodoxy, which I've read so many times, it's probably kind of silly. But when you look at a book like that, you're expecting a book on apologetics, but the arguments he gives you are just like, okay, let's say you just want to be a human in this world. Like, how would you approach the question of belief? Like, take it as presupposed, not some kind of broad metaphysical assumption, but just that you want to be a healthy human with a full life and an interesting who approaches the creation we're given with a certain amount of curiosity and vivacity. How would you have to approach the topic of spirituality? And from that, he derives, in very vague strokes, the Christian perspective on the world. And and I think that's I think the magic of people like Chesterton and Belloc and a variety of other thinkers that come from the early 20th century of the Christian persuasion. Tolkien would very much be another example of that. And I think we need to recapture some of that. I'm always a little bit cautious because GK Chesterton has kind of become a meme, like all young Catholic men are into him. And so it's kind of, you're always like, having a Catholic account named after GK Chesterton is like having an atheist account that has monkey or ape in its title.
Monkey fish, yeah. Well, just to that point, like there's someone, a member of my community by the name of Aesop Wakan. He's, from what I can tell, a right anarchist atheist, and he told me, he knew I was going to talk to you, and he said, mentioned The Man Who Was Thursday, and he said that should be required reading for all dissidents. Is he right, or is he a dumb piece of shit?
Oh, I love that book. That's a great book. I don't know if you're really going to get like a lot of political direction, but it's like a beautiful allegory. And I do like, there's an Orson Welles reading of The Man Who Was Thursday, like a radio play that I really like too. That's a little bit faster than reading the entire book. I love, the ending is beautiful, like most GK Chesterton endings. But I would consider it sort of the equivalent of Father Brown, that's sort of a series, but there are a lot of other stories in that series that are equally kind of, they're beautiful human stories. And, and I don't know, Chesterton is just like this treasure trove of different things. And some people get more out of some and some people get more out of others.
You had mentioned Tolkien as well and a couple other authors, and I was wondering, do you see any living or popular authors right now who kind of follow in that tradition, or is this just locked in the past?
The living author that seemed to follow in that tradition, although I think he's completely retired from politics, was Wendell Berry. And he was I think he's still alive. And before him was Walker Percy, he's a great novelist, a Southerner, and he wrote a variety of excellent books, my favorite being Love in the Ruins. But he's most famous for being the publisher, not the writer, but the publisher of the manuscript of Confederacy of Dunces, whose author famously killed himself before it was submitted. And as Peter O'Toole, I think, was the writer. But Walker Percy and Wendell Berry are the two literary figures. I think that from 1970 to 2000, we stopped sort of making people like that. We discouraged this kind of approach to the world. So the people who I'm mentioning are all baby boomers or older. But I think that there are more minor writers these days who are trying their hands at work. I think that the problem is that, and I'm one to speak, but the social media age has created this space where kind of deeper works of spirituality are kind of forgotten, and sort of the best sort of fiction writers on the distant sphere that I can think of are all kind of like horror writers like Zero HP Lovecraft or something
Yeah.
like that. These people write cynical takes on the universe, and they have an artistic dimension to them, certainly, but they don't have like that merit, like the wonderment that Chesterton is able to capture and bring forward. And maybe we need to go through this eye of the needle. Certainly, I love people like Owen Cyclops, but these are all like online content creators. I'm not talking about like Wendell Berry. These are serious literary figures. And I just think that the problem right now is there's just been a purge of literary figures such that I think that the publishing houses are only publishing a certain kind of person. Like they're incredibly ideological these days. You might remember Joyce Carol Oates. She had this tweet that publishing houses aren't even entertaining new white male authors. I mean, this is insane, but
yeah,
that's what I'm hearing.
No, I've seen that too, because just to the point you had made before, I thought that was a really good departure we could take as well into publishing, because many years ago, I ran my own tiny small press in Toronto, and I'm working right now to launch another one for some other people. But I did notice that, first of all, what you had said is completely correct. Anyone who gives you sort of reports from the inside of publishing, it is an absolute fucking shit show. But the funny thing is, and I'm sure people might know this, but anyone who knows anything about the publishing industry will tell you that, for example, Tor Books, which is the lead, legacy publisher of a lot of sci-fi, they only got maybe 2 or 3 titles.
Not to be confused with the internet browser.
Yeah, exactly. The Tor Books, like, they got maybe 2 or 3 books that keep the lights on at that place. One of them would be Orson Scott Card, and then nothing they release makes money. So I find that amusing. I don't enjoy watching people suffer, but I like watching businesses shake. So it's like, when I look at that, I'm like, okay, what's it going to take? Because apparently it's not making money, and you don't seem to care about that. I would have thought the breaking point would have been 5 years ago. I'm wrong. So everything's on the table. I don't know if it'll last till the end of this year or maybe forever, because the rules don't seem to apply to these motherfuckers anymore.
I don't know. I guess businesses don't need to make any money. I'm starving for dissident fiction. I will buy the Passage Price book when the price comes down to something that's, in my opinion, more reasonable. But I'm not really a reader of short stories. If I read something fictional, it's got to be a novel. So
that's interesting, because when I spoke with Dave Martell, he's got an opinion that I'm 70% sold on, where he says that the future of fiction in this space will be short stories because of how, like, people's attention span and stuff. That's kind of what the thing I'm working on is. But you had raised a point that I never considered before, and it pains me to admit it, because I'm a guy who writes horror fiction, and I'm a guy who likes writing dark sci-fi, and it is kind of a meme on this side. Like, everyone's writing horror stories. Everyone's writing these cynical, these dark, these miserable. It's like,
dark, cyberpunk, Lovecraftian horror. Those are our genres, right? That's our imagination.
Oh, you think you're living in hell? Hold my hard cider. And then, but I something you said, like, I must challenge myself to write more positive fiction. Something like, not to say anyone could write Lord of the Rings, but Lord of the Rings was not this grim, dark, shitty, cynical book. The core of Lord of the Rings, the core of all of this best fiction, the stuff that you cite, is this love of life and humanity and this positive vision of the world that we just lack. And we're just trying to, like, outblade each other. And perhaps, and this is something I've been saying, that as the Dissident Right becomes more prolific in the content it produces, maybe we need to make a headline that horror is hack. Like, we got to start challenging people to get trying to out-suffer the world. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, there were a few. There's a genre of fiction that I kind of like, and so do you know Whit Stillman?
No.
Okay, so he's like an American filmmaker. I think he's retired at this stage, but people sometimes call him the Wasp Woody Allen. And he makes like these cute little movies about like turbo white bread, like elite WASP Americans, but somehow like they're the rebels. So it's like the sorority girls, and they're all like straight laced, and they're kind of rebelling against like a gross university culture of drunkards. or like a group of debutantes in Manhattan in the 80s. And like they're very sophisticated and they're kind of existing in a world that like somehow like they're just this fossilized specimen walking, or like they would have been at home like 100 years ago, but now like they're just there for some reason. And so he did like the Last Days of Disco, Metropolitan, stuff like that. And I always thought like it would be kind of interesting to see sort of the traditionalists as cute rebels. Some people have tried this. There's been there was a play that came out a few years ago, I think, called Heroes of the Fourth Turning. And there actually was this Israeli show. You can tell why they got it. 1 minute. I might have to go soon. I apologize for that. You could so there was an Israeli show called Shugrim. I think that's what it's called. It's I think it's the name of like a headscarf that Orthodox women wear. And it's about like these punky little traditionalist Orthodox Jews who are rebels against the sort of like degraded Israeli mainstream society. And it's like it's this fun little portrayal of like people who just don't want to participate in modernity, period. And what they go through. And of course, like I know progressives who love this, obviously, because, you know, it was, if this had been made about Christians and not Orthodox Jews, it would have never gotten progressive acceptance. But like, it just shows you that like there is a genre of there. You can imagine like a cute little comedy about rebels and inside a larger degenerating society, right? It doesn't have to be like all cyberpunk or all Lovecraftian horror about being locked in a pod.
Exactly. And it's funny that I guess it's ironic that the people who are trying to sell the rest of the world on this, our positive vision of the world, all we can tell is we can only tell stories that are starring anti-heroes who become sober for 10 days and then have 2 guns. You know, like we actually don't, the moment we start to wrap our heads around how we can produce fiction that makes our side look less caustic and antisocial. And I say this not to you specifically, but to everyone, you know, because of the people in the scene, you are one of the, you know, more normal ones, but you know, all up there, everyone's getting too meta and weird and sarcastic. And even the guys who seem to be the happiest ones are kind of, you know, absorbing this way of being that is very caustic and alienating to the average person. And I'm going to, if anything, during this interview, I'm going to start challenging myself to start telling stories that aren't just, you know, especially if you deal in sci-fi, it's so easy to get, you know, I'm going to come up with an alien world. Well, of course it's going to be fucked up and maddening. And plus everyone seems to be just still ripping off H.P. Lovecraft. So I guess we have maybe 45 more years of that before we move on to the next thing.
It's hard to do absurdity like Hitchhiker's Guide because satire is very difficult because Clown World just kind of makes it irrelevant. But I might have to get going in about a few minutes. But so I'll have to come on for another time, maybe to talk about that.
No, that'd be great. I know, and never, you know, don't feel like you have to apologize for your child. I've got one on the way myself, and I'm trying to think about how I'm going to do it because that thing that just happened to you will be happening to me a lot more, and I don't know what I'm going to fucking do.
It's not as bad. I just don't have a very good studio for sound control, unfortunately. I have a smaller area. But anyway, though, thank you for having me on. I might have to have an early exit, but it has been very interesting conversation, I have to say.
Do not let the rapists win. Listen and love Blood Satellite.